Well, we are going to look at the book of Nehemiah. You may remember the famous song, Nehemiah was a bullfrog. Isn't it Nehemiah was a bullfrog? Oh, okay. Well, anyway. Oh, Jeremiah and Nehemiah, same thing. Okay. Well, anyway. I'm just kidding. Anyway, I was thinking Nehemiah would be a really good book because, you know, hopefully we're coming out of this COVID situation and everything has changed. I mean, really, whether it's stuff with the church or in our personal lives or, people's jobs. I mean, everything has changed, the government, everything. And, it's a time. I remember I was teaching a class one time and I had a picture of the sun, right on the horizon. And my question was this a sunrise or a sunset? And, that's true for anything in life, I mean, things are going to change, but the question is, are they going to change for the better? Are we heading toward a sunrise or are we heading toward a sunset, And so Nehemiah really, is a book that really kind of came out of a lot of diversity, with the Jewish people. And being able to return back to their homeland and so many changes and a lot of work to do. And so I just thought it was a very befitting book for us to check out. So here we are, Nehemiah chapter 1. So let's do a few questions as usual to get us kind of thinking on the same page. But my first question is, what is pragmatism and should Christians be pragmatic? It's kind of similar to, yeah. Hurry, look it up on your telephones real quick. It's similar. Yeah, I'll go ahead and tell you, pragmatic is, if this doesn't work, you're willing to change. And if this doesn't work, then you're willing to change. If this doesn't work, you're willing to change. And well, yeah, I mean, it falls into that category, I guess. It was Einstein who said that the definition of stupidity is to do the same thing over and over and over again and expect different results. So obviously he was a pragmatist. So that brings me back to the question, should Christians be pragmatic? Okay. Well, maybe the question is a little bit too deep. Remember, when it comes to God's word, we should not be pragmatic. We want to obey God. We want to be faithful to God. That doesn't mean things are going to work out the way we think they should work out. But we still need to be faithful and do things the way that God wants us to do it. Now, there's a lot of other areas of life where we can be pragmatic. But in other words, there's times to be pragmatic and there's times when not to be pragmatic. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. Is there a relationship between security and freedom? And if so, would one be more important than the other? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, let me put it to you this way. If you're locked up in a jail cell with guards around you, you have security, but then you have virtually no freedom. Now you can be living under an overpass in a cardboard box and have freedom but not have security. Does that make sense? In some ways they're the opposites of one another. And I think the key factor there is you don't want to be in the jail cell and you don't want to be living in a cardboard box, right? So there's got to be that little fine balance in there because think about it. You know, as we get older, we really get usually more desirous. Is that the word, desirous? We get a little bit more fearful and we desire more security. But when we're young, we're free-hearted. We want freedom, baby. Get away from mom and dad. Get away from the system. You know, we want to be free, right? Free drugs and free sex. Well, that's what some people say. Right? That's freedom, right? So, but again, you can go to one extreme or the other, and so there's got to be a healthy biblical balance in there somewhere. Amen? These are deep questions, aren't they? Yeah, I thought I'd get you today on this one. Okay. Well, we need to lock our door when we're in heaven. Why or why not? I like Art's answer. He said it's a good neighborhood. I'll tell you one reason why you won't need to lock your door. Because Scripture tells us that heaven has walls and gates. Yeah. In fact, we talked a lot about that when we were in the book of Revelation. Remember? Has walls and gates. So why would heaven need walls and gates? It is interesting, isn't it? So you can hang pictures. Art, you're the man. You're the man. Yeah, what are you going to lean up against? Yeah. Well, we have to use the bathroom in heaven. Because, you know, I'd still like to be able to close the door. You know. What if your house right now was the walls are made out of glass inside and out and everybody could see in? Would you do anything different? But don't tell me about it. Okay. What's the difference between a manager and a leader? A manager can work under a leader. Yeah, because a manager is exactly what that title implies. They manage, right? That's why usually people like their manager, because when their wheels start squeaking, the manager runs over there and oils it right away, right? His job is to keep the wheels moving and to stop the squeaks. But the leader is someone ultimately that they're probably going to hate sometimes, because the leader is your vision caster. And the leader, you hope your leaders have a vision from God, and he wants to move the collective group from point A to point B. And everybody wants what's at the finish line, right? We all want the prize at the finish line, but we don't always want to go through the process of getting to the finish line. So, and the leader not only is the vision caster, he's got to be able to he or she has to sell that vision to the manager. Because the manager has to then help sell that vision to those under he or she, right? Yeah, well, the thing is, I can call myself a leader, but then when I turn around, there's nobody behind me following me. Then does that make me a leader? You see? So you want the people to be able to bequeath upon you the title of leader, but you also need them to follow you. And to follow you, it means they've got to trust you. There has to be hopefully some loyalty has built up, maybe love, right? Dependability upon one another. Well, we could talk about this all night, really, if you think about it, right? So, there can be a really big dynamic between a leader and a manager. And again, the manager, if you got a good manager, people usually love them, but then the leader is the one that usually you want to blame for everything, And the problem in the church is if things turn out good, we say, praise Jesus! And if things go bad, usually you blame the pastor, right? Yeah, I was going to say, if somebody ever comes in here to complain, I'll say, my name is Art Swanson. Yeah, but anyway. Okay. Why do you suppose Nehemiah would have so much passion for a city that he probably never saw before? And we'll get into that passion. He's got a great passion for Jerusalem. And he probably had never been there. Must have heard something. Yeah, it must have been something in his DNA, right? Maybe the way he was brought up. We all kind of take some level of pride, don't we, maybe in our heritage or, and I'm not talking about bad pride, but I'm talking about the good pride that we have. Pride in family or pride in heritage or pride in nationality or something, So, we're going to see that he's a very, very passionate leader. Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer. So how would those skills transfer to Nehemiah's restoration of Jerusalem? Paul. Yeah. I mean, what was the job of the cupbearer? Taste the wine and make sure it's not poison, right? And so there's a lot of trust there. Nehemiah had to trust the people from the vineyard, and the king had to trust him. And there's a lot of trust there because, I'll tell you, if you ever go to YouTube, I wouldn't know like exactly how to type this in, but type in something like assassinations of monarchs, and it's unbelievable how many kings over the centuries were killed. And some of them were killed in horrible, horrible ways. It was a very common thing. From poisoning to people hiding in the privy and going in with the sword. I mean, just horrible, horrible things. So, it was a very, very common thing. So, there had to be a lot of trust. And again, that goes to what I was saying before. When you have a leader, it's got to be someone that's going to be loyal, someone you're going to trust. What secular skills do you have that could transfer to service in God's kingdom? Most of you, if you're not retired, have worked secular jobs. And surely there's something that you could transfer to God's kingdom. I'm not talking about gifts now, because we all have spiritual gifts. That's a whole other category. But this would be secular skills, knowledge, training, and experience. Yeah, in a trade, bargaining for products. What about relations with people? Learning how to deal with people. You got if you work retail, like Shelley works retail, she tells me about her nice customers, and she tells me about her yucky customers, and she has to deal with them, right? And I can't even repeat what horrible things customers do and say, and she has to deal with that day in and day out, just about, So, and wouldn't that help us dealing with even our Christian brothers and sisters? Being people. Yeah, because if you love God, deep down in your heart, you will love people. You may not always like people. You may want to strangle them once in a while, but deep down in your heart, you're going to love people if you love God, because God made people in His image. And so if we love Him, then we certainly must love each other. And sometimes the sheep bite. Yeah. Sometimes you got nice little lambs, and sometimes you've got old goats. And they do bite. And so learning to be a people person and dealing with people. What are some other things that we can carry over from our secular job? I know, Art, you have a vast knowledge of all kinds of things, with plumbing and electric and all kinds of stuff, and you're constantly fixing something, aren't you? Because there's a physical aspect to the church, there's also a spiritual aspect, and they're both important. I know so many churches that they started getting leaky roofs, but they never really did anything about it. They thought, oh, well, somebody will donate the money, but then the money never came. And now they're begging for money now from other churches, because now the county has condemned the building, condemned the sanctuary. Maybe they got damaged during the hurricanes, and they couldn't afford to get it all fixed, and now they have to close the church down. And how grateful we are, to people that know how to do stuff, really. We're blessed. What is the first, second, and third step in the problem-solving process? Ooh, that's good. That's good. She said identifying the problem. I forgot who originally said this quote, but somebody once said, "The problem properly defined is already half of the solution." And so often we see the problem, but we've not really defined it yet. And once we really define what the problem is, now we can sit there and we can really, find a genuine solution to the problem. All too often we put Band-Aids on problems, don't we? We put Band-Aids on symptoms, but we're not really addressing the root of the problem. So, yeah, that's the first thing. Analyze the situation, right? And properly define what the problem is. Yeah. Yes, prioritize. In fact, you'll see that pretty much Nehemiah does just what I taught not too long ago. I was teaching how to make a decision, remember, when we were in Ruth? To pray, plan, prepare, pursue, and providence. And you have to ask yourself always, is it biblical? What are your circumstances, godly counsel, and Holy Spirit discernment? And you'll see that Nehemiah in many ways does the exact same thing. So, yeah. Well, very good. All right, now it's going to be a big introduction because it's a lot to say here. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah are very closely related, and so were combined from an early period, but internal evidence affirms that these texts originated as two separate compositions. For example, both Josephus and the Jewish Talmud refer to the book of Ezra, but not to a separate book of Nehemiah. That's because at one point they were considered to be one book. Well, yes. I'll tell you why in just a second. Yeah, boy, believe me, it's confusing. Believe me. Origen was the first writer known to distinguish between the two books, which he called 1st and 2nd Ezra. Simply put, the content and compiling of official lists and writing styles and even almost verbatim sentences suggest that Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles were written by the same person. They're also typical of other non-biblical documents of the Persian period. So you might be wondering, well, that still doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, so the book of Ezra, we could call that Ezra's personal memoirs that he was documenting. We've got that. We've got Nehemiah's personal memoirs. And several decades later, Ezra compiled his and Nehemiah's memoirs along with additional information. So he kind of rewrote everything nicely and put all the information together. So that's why it is in Ezra's writing style. But it is two separate compositions. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes. There were certainly higher illiteracy rates than we have today. But I think a lot of that has to do with the culture. You know, like if you were Jewish, you were pretty much taught to read and write. And you had to spend so much time with a rabbi as a boy, learning the fundamentals. You know, it's kind of like confirmation classes. You know, you take classes under a rabbi, and then when you've proven that you know all that you need to know, you know, for the basics, if you were a girl at the age of 12, you had your bat mitzvah celebration, which was your celebration into womanhood. And if you were a boy, the age was 13. You'd have your bar mitzvah, and that was your celebration into manhood. And by that point in time, they were expected to have known all the basics. You know, they memorized the Torah, which is just the first kind of 5 books. They had to pretty much know that. You know, their fathers would have already been teaching them skills, you know, like if they were carpenters or, you know, whatever their profession was. So they were learning a profession, they were learning religion, they were learning a lot of this stuff. But, you know, you go to other cultures and they were probably a lot more illiterate. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. There's pretty much no doubt that Ezra rewrote everything nicely. He was a scholar, and that's what he did. That was the more research I've done, the more I agree that that was his thing. He was good at that. Yeah. Now, in Ezra's case, remember they were all in. Well, let me back this up. We're going to get into this, but I'll go ahead and tell you. You remember when Babylon invaded Israel? One of the captives was Daniel. Remember that? And then after 70 years of captivity in Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire came in and took over Babylon, okay? So they all had jobs under that government, okay? But what you'll find is Ezra gets sent to Israel, Nehemiah gets sent to Israel, and they got paid really from the Persian government. But it was money that was allotted to the Jews anyway, because that was their land. The Persians controlled the land, so they had an obligation to take care of the people to some degree, you know, as well. Yes, yeah. And there's a lot of names, and a couple of the monarchs had two names, and then it starts getting confusing. Because I don't know if now it's Darius, and then Xerxes, and then Xerxes, his son then was Artaxerxes the first, also known as Cyrus. It's easy to get mixed up. Oh, so yeah, I mean, everybody had to work a job, right? You know, and in this case, when Persia sent them back to Israel or back to Jerusalem, they're technically working for the government. So yeah, they were given money to live, and yeah. Now, according to the traditional view, which is probably the correct view, Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes the first, followed by Nehemiah, who arrived in the king's 20th year. Okay, I'll reword that a little bit differently here in a minute. Any alternative view starts creating problems, yet it's safe to say that both Ezra and Nehemiah were contemporaries, and they were found together at the reading of the law in Nehemiah 8:9, and at the dedication of the wall in Nehemiah 12:26 and 36. So they worked together. They were like tag team partners. One was more the physical manager, and Ezra was more of the scholarly, spiritual leader, okay? So they each had their specialties, and they worked together, and they wouldn't have been able to accomplish what they accomplished if they hadn't worked together. Ezra and Nehemiah were written in a form of late Hebrew, except for 67 Aramaic verses, which was the language of international diplomacy during the Persian period. The major theological themes of this account are: the restoration of Israel from exile was God's plan by moving the hearts of the Persian emperors. He also raised up prophets to prod and thwart the exiles. God protected them from their enemies, and he called Ezra and Nehemiah to perform separate ministries. Israel remained under Gentile rule, but the restoration of God's covenant community was through the remnant that was permitted to return. The temple had been rebuilt, the daily sacrifices resumed, the priestly services continued, and the annual feasts were observed. So the people experienced a revival by reinstituting the law of Moses and the regulations of King David. And God used the powers of the world to judge his people because of their sin, and God used the world powers again to restore his wayward people back to their land. God blessed every aspect of their restoration. So this is really a God thing. And if you see how things kind of fall in place, that'll make a lot of sense. I don't know if anybody's taking notes. If I go too fast, let me know. Nehemiah's personality is the outstanding quality of this book that bears his name. No other biblical character gives such clear information about the role of godly leadership. I mean, the only other greater leader in the Bible that I see is Jesus. But we're not Jesus, and we can't do everything Jesus did because he's God and we're not. But Nehemiah is therefore a really, really great example to go by. Ezra and Nehemiah worked as tag team partners, and their opposite styles complemented one another. Nehemiah was an activist, whereas Ezra was a student. Why I say Ezra was a student? Ezra was supposed to go a little bit earlier back to Jerusalem, but he was still under the tutelage of a rabbi. And the rabbi was too old to go back to Jerusalem. You know what I'm saying? So he got there a little bit later, a couple years later. He's maybe a little bit green around the ears, but again, he's very, very capable. Where Nehemiah was a little bit older, a little bit wiser in handling other things. Nehemiah was an organizational leader, whereas Ezra was a spiritual leader. Nehemiah was outspoken, whereas Ezra was a little bit more withdrawn. Together they faced similar problems and had similar successes. This is a good lesson for us, realizing that God assembles different people with different backgrounds and skills. It's the perfect prototype or picture of the church, isn't it? All different kinds of people, all different kinds of backgrounds. And I guarantee that everybody here has skills that the other person doesn't have. And even if we have spiritual gifts that are kind of the same, we express those spiritual gifts in different, unique ways. And so God put us together for a reason, right? And when we work together, we could accomplish a lot. I think we can accomplish anything, really. But it's when Christians start trying to do Lone Ranger stuff that sometimes when they get in trouble, because you'll never see anybody really operating as a Lone Ranger in the Bible. Jesus sent them out at least 2 by 2, and people were always supposed to work together as a team. And then, because we don't always do what's expected of us, but we always usually do what's inspected of us. And so when you got somebody there holding you accountable, and you're holding them accountable, chances are the job's going to get done. Nehemiah includes some long lists of different family groups as well as a detailed description of who built various parts of the Jerusalem wall. Yet we should concentrate more on how the Israelites had been transformed and purified. Because God allowed them to be captured in the first place and distributed all over the known world because of their sin. But now a lot of time had gone by, and God has transformed them and purified them and developed them, and they're still far from perfect, obviously, like us. But that's a good thing to kind of look at right there. This transformation and purification prepared them to meet the new challenges for their return home. Nehemiah, like Esther, had made his way to a top position in the Persian Empire, yet his heart was in Jerusalem. And just to kind of put things into context, Israel was conquered by Babylon during the time of Daniel, and in turn Babylon was conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire. So if you remember back when we were in Daniel, remember that? We've got Babylon up here, and somewhere up in here is when Daniel was captured. And 70 years later, what happened? The Medo-Persian Empire came in and took over, and that represents the silver part of the statue. And then, of course, eventually the Greco world, the Hellenistic era came in with the Greeks, and then, of course, ultimately then the Romans, right? The Persian kings had some sympathy for the Israelites. For example, Daniel's name was changed to the Babylonian name Belshazzar. Remember that? And Hadassah, in English it's Myrtle, her name was changed to Esther, which is either a derivative of the Babylonian Ishtar or the Persian word star. But Nehemiah was permitted to retain his Hebrew name. So you can see how the thought processes were changing as time went on. The Persian kings also permitted some of the Jewish exiles to return home. And the fact is, a lot of them didn't want to go home. Okay? I don't know if I'm bringing that up now or not. Yeah, the first wave was led by Zerubbabel, returned after about 70 years after the exile began, and he returned with 50,000 people. The second wave, led by Ezra, returned about 80 years after Zerubbabel with around 5,000 people. Not nearly as many this time. Yeah, because, they lived in these other lands for so long, and they got married, they had foreign spouses, they had children, they had grandchildren, they had a home, They didn't want to now give everything up now and pack up and get divorced and, hey, let's go back, They didn't want to do that. The third wave was actually led by Nehemiah. He returned, and this is all based on my math, so I might have to get Barbara to check up on me and recalculate my calculations. But I figure about 13 years later is when Nehemiah came, after Ezra, with an undetermined number of people. They don't really say how many people. We know that an army went with him because he went there with guards, with a whole army escort and everything, So there were definitely people with him, but we don't know how many. Interestingly, many of the Jews didn't want to return, I just said that, to Israel because over such a long period of time, most of them had no memory of their homeland. They had well-established marriages with foreigners. They had assimilated to pagan cultures. They had little or no knowledge of the Hebrew language. Some of them spoke Hebrew, and a lot of them couldn't speak it anymore. In fact, golly, by the time you get to Jesus' day, very few people spoke Hebrew, and the Hebrew Bible didn't even exist anymore because it was translated during the Hellenistic period into Greek. And so then a bunch of Jewish scholars got together and said, hey, we need to have our book in our own language. And so what they had to do is they had to translate from the Greek text back over to Hebrew because there was no more Hebrew text. That's why I don't believe all those Bible codes that they talk about, because there's no way that could be accurate with all the translation and retranslation and retranslation. They lost their Jewish identity. In fact, of those who did return, most settled outside of Jerusalem, so the holy city remained in ruins. The only thing that had been rebuilt was the temple by Zerubbabel. And that's why that is often referred to as the Zerubbabel temple. Zerubbabel almost sounds like rubble, doesn't it? It's like rubble all over the place, right? So, however, Ezra did accomplish a lot during his 13 years in Jerusalem. I don't want you to think that he didn't do anything. He was just a different kind of manager, different kind of a guy, different kind of a leader. Again, he was a spiritual leader, and if we would have settled out west during the 1800s, where there were no sheriffs, no law enforcement whatsoever, it could be a kill or be killed situation, right? People were packing guns a lot more back then and shooting each other and stuff like that. And again, it's the same kind of a situation here. There was a lot of lawlessness, okay? Lot of robbing and stealing and killing and horrible things taking place. Religiously speaking, Ezra understood the threats to their culture and future as a nation, so he established Aliyah. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Aliyah still exists today. It was a series of initiatives which all had to be licensed and approved by the Persian government. He just couldn't do this himself. He had to get funding and permission and licenses and decrees and everything to do this. But it was initiatives to influence the lives of the Jews that were returning to Israel. These initiatives include the transfer of the holy vessels back to the temple in Jerusalem. Now, I got a little bit of a problem with that. Because if those vessels were defiled, that means that all has to be melted down again and redone. Remember, we've talked about that before? Because once the holy vessels are defiled, you can't use them anymore. And I think didn't the Babylonians party with all the vessels? And yeah, so reallocation of Jewish funds to provide those returning with money, wheat, wine, and oil. Because hey, you have these hungry immigrants coming in, right? And it costs money. Tax exemptions for all who served in the temple, such as priests, Levites, and their assistants. To this very day, not all governments, but our government, at least for a little while, gives tax breaks to clergy. And you can see where it started back then. They wanted to give tax breaks to those who worked in the temple. And the reason why is because religious people, clerical people, whatever you want to call them, they're performing a public service. They're, I don't know, like the religious leaders in Jesus' day were pretty corrupt. But when you think about, the church today, we certainly welcome people to come in. Very often I've got to counsel people that are going through all kinds of different problems in their lives. Could be marital problems, could be problems with the children, violence, anger issues, drug abuse, you name it. I mean, I hear it. I think I've heard it all. I've heard it all, okay? Try to help them or, get them on the right path to where we can send them somewhere for help. We work, for example, with a care center, so hungry people can get food, Sometimes you have battered women that the care center take into their housing. And they want to do one for men, too, that need housing. I don't know if they've got that done. Well, you work there. Yeah, because the housing where they have the women and their children, they don't want to mix men with them. You know what I'm saying? So it's, and, when you think about how much the church does for a community, and so that's the whole purpose, that it performs a public service to help the people in the community. It's a shame more people don't avail themselves of that, right? Really, if you think about it. So tax exemptions, appointment of judges to teach the law of God, and with the authority to confiscate assets, banish, or execute criminals as needed. Yeah, what if you set up all these rules, but now you can't enforce those rules? Then those rules mean nothing, do they? So you got to be able to enforce them, and they had to be policemen. They had to get tough. Ezra served as the high priest and along with other scholars established an assembly of leaders that made decisions for the nation. Their purpose was to maintain public order by strengthening the immigrants' relationship to the Torah and to their Jewish identity. Ezra also revolutionized the usage of the Hebrew alphabet. So he was a real scholar, and he rewrote everything, and, Yeah, I mean, he knew what he was doing, and by God's grace, if he would not have rewritten Nehemiah's stuff nicely, and we may not have it today, so, yeah. So one question you kind of get in is, and I hear this once in a blue moon, is how many Jewish temples were there? Paul. But your answer is just one. Well, that's a good answer. It wouldn't be my answer, but that was a good answer. Well, we normally think of Solomon's temple, and then, of course, it got knocked down. We think of Zerubbabel's temple, and then we think of Herod's temple, but then there's other references, and we're thinking, well, what is that? What is that? We don't know. So here's the way I understand it. First of all, they had the tabernacle, okay? And that was not the temple. The tabernacle means tent. When somebody lived in a tent in the Bible, you called it a tent. But if you called something a tabernacle, it was a tent, but it was God's tent. So not every tent is a tabernacle. Yes. Yes. And you have to realize that the Israelites were roaming, remember years ago, the wilderness for 40 years. And so they needed mobile homes, so they lived in tents, right? Something they could break down and carry with them to the next site. They could set it back up again. So I gave that one a 0 because that's not a that's not a temple, okay? So the first temple, actually, everybody usually is Solomon's temple. Again, that's a solid structure, but with the same basic design as the tabernacle, but twice as large. It was destroyed in 586 BC when Babylon conquered Jerusalem. Okay? Then Zerubbabel got sent in under the Persian government, and he built a temple during the Persian period. But the temple was not as big, and it was not nearly as nice. It was really yucko. Okay, it was not great at all, because the people had no motivation. They wanted to build their own houses. They don't want to sit there and build a temple. You know, they had their own houses to build. And what about businesses? How are they going to make money if they have no businesses, right? So there was no enthusiasm whatsoever. And, you know, you can only get so much money from the government, right? Yeah, David assembled all the materials together, but God said there's blood on your hands, so he didn't let David do it, so the job went to Solomon. So Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple under the Persian period, and then during the Hellenistic period, it was remodeled. So some people might give that a different name, but it's still considered the same temple, okay? Then it had to be rebuilt and expanded during the Roman period, where it was known as Herod's temple. So sometimes Herod's temple is still considered the second temple, and sometimes it's considered the third temple. So it's very confusing, whatever you're reading, which is the first and the second and the third and the fourth, okay? Why did it have to be rebuilt? Well, first of all, it was really old and falling apart. Yeah. I mean, he was good at that. He was good at construction projects. So he, you know, built this humongous temple, unbelievably huge, very, very fancy, very ornate. You know, the inside of Solomon's temple was covered with gold. And, you know, Herod, you know, made sure that the sanctuary inside was covered with gold. And, I mean, he did a really good job. You know, it was first-class temple and everything. But another reason why it had to be rebuilt goes back to what I said a few minutes ago. During the intertestamental period between the Greeks and the Romans, there was that 400 years of silence, remember? We're running out of time. And Antiochus Epiphanes invaded the temple. He slaughtered pigs in the temple, sacrificed them to Zeus. Then he even boiled the blood and the pigs and took the bloody pig broth and he dumped it all over everything in the temple, and he defiled it. That's the word I'm looking for. He defiled the temple, and so really they couldn't use that temple anymore. It had to be completely redone. So, and we're out of time. So remember that slide. That's where we're going to start off next week.